Welcome everybody to the SRA webinar series. We have a big attendance number today for today's exciting webinar. All of the SRA webinars, including this one, are available on the SRA website as videos for members. This one's being recorded as have all the past ones. Today we'll be taking questions throughout. You can type your questions throughout the webinar. We're going to do all of the answers at the end. We'll end about 40 minutes after we begin, and then we'll start doing the questions at that point. You can type them into the questions section on your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll see them as the moderator, and I'll repeat them to Thierry, who will then answer them. So today's webinar is part of, not only is it part of the SRA webinar series, it's part of a discrete series within the SRA webinar series. Thierry will give us details on that in just a little bit. But our title today is Core Subjects of Risk Analysis 1, Introduction and Overview, Fundamentals of Risk Analysis. Our presenter is Thierry Aven, who is the current president of the Society for Risk Analysis and is a professor for risk assessment and risk management at the University of Stavanger, Norway. And with that, Thierry, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much, Brett. I also like to welcome you all to this webinar. And I hope you are really ready for some reflections about fundamental concepts of risk analysis, probability, uncertainty, knowledge, risk, and science. So it's the first of this series. But before I go into that, I would just to sort of repeat, saying how I interpret risk analysis. Risk analysis in this context is really the SRA interpretation of risk analysis, covering everything, linked to risk assessment, risk characterization, risk perception and communication, risk management and policies on risk, and all type of applications. So as Brett was mentioning, this is a series of core subjects of risk analysis with 7 webinars. This is the first one on the fundamentals, and then we have next one, the 9th April, with Seth Goikema on risk assessment, and the other will be announced later. And now also some of the others will address some fundamental issues, like for example number 6 on causation and risk with Tony Cox. Okay. Now we refer to this core subjects of risk analysis, and that's a document that is available on the website. On this, you see the link there. And this document was produced in 2016, 2017 by this committee. So I think we can say that it's a quite strong basis for this work. Also, we had some people giving comments to this document in an earlier version, and it has now been revised. And I think it's in a sort of okay form and provide a basis for further discussions. And it has 5 overall headings: fundamentals, risk assessment, risk perception and communication, risk management and governance, and solving real risk problem and issues. Okay, so let's start with number 1. And that is, as I said, more about the fundamental aspects. And if you go into that document on that particular part on the fundamentals, is a lot of text, but I will focus on some issues. You see this is the text from the document, and I would just read the first sentence here. This area covers fundamental issues related to risk analysis as a field in science, basic concepts and principles. And I just have to, sorry, the text is blocked for me here. Principles of risk analysis, including ways of representing and expressing uncertainties. And then there's a lot of text and details about what that is all about. And I will cover all of that. I will focus on these 5 topics: the risk analysis field in science, and what is risk, knowledge, uncertainty and imprecision, and probability. And actually, I will start with probability and uncertainty, and then end up with the last part on risk analysis field and science. Okay? Yeah, before I go on into that, I will just sort of highlight that as a base for this discussion here, I have the SRA glossary, which is available on the website, the same link. Also a document called Risk Analysis Fundamental Principles, which provides some sort of guidance on how to think in relation to risk analysis. Also, I've been using, of course, research on this topic for the last 10, 20 years that I've been involved in on these fundamental aspects of risk analysis. Okay, so then we should be ready to go into the first concept that I would like to address, and that is probability. And I was thinking about having an example that was quite interesting, and I found this one related to IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They are saying something like this: it is extremely likely, at least 95% probability, that most of the current global warming trend is the result of human activity. Okay, what does it mean? Let's first try to formalize this a little. We have the statement, I call it A. Most of the current global warming trend is a result of human activity. So the probability of A is at least 95% is the statement. Now, we can have a discussion about what is the meaning of this statement A. I mean, most of the current global warming trend, what is that? Human activity, what is that? I will not go into that. That's not part of the discussion here. That you can find in the IPCC reports. What is the meaning of that? I simply assume for this discussion here that A is a statement that is either true or not according to some criteria. So A is a statement, either it's true or not according to some criteria, and we have a statement like this: probability of A is at least 95%. What is the meaning of this? This is the question. And if you look at the IPCC reports, this is a very important issue, an important result, important statement. So it should be possible to give an interpretation of this. What does it actually mean? But if you look at the IPCC reports, it's difficult to find, I would say, a meaningful interpretation of this statement. I really looked into it. Also, the basic underlying documentation related to sort of uncertainty treatment and risk treatment. There's no actually interpretation on that I can find satisfactory on what that means. And we, as a risk analyst experts, should be able to say, what is the meaning of this statement? It's really basic. And let me also give another example to focus on an event. And it's linked to, it's quite a simple example, but we have the annual meeting for SRA coming up in December this year in New Orleans. I hope you all will be there. And I have defined an event as follows. Number of participants is greater than 700. That's an event. Either it's true or it's not. It will occur or not occur. Number of participants is greater than 700, or it will not be greater than. It will be less or less than 700. So let me now say that I assign a probability to this. Probability is 95%, or I say that probability is at least 95%. And the question is again, what is the meaning of these statements? Fundamental statements we have in risk analysis, but what is the meaning of this probability or these probabilities? We should be able to do that. And okay, I will now present what I think, or what I sort of is the recommended way of interpreting, understanding this kind of probability. Okay, and let's start with this statement that the probability is 95%, 0.95. That is, we start with that first. This means that the assessor the assigner, has the same uncertainty, the same degree of belief for the event A to occur, or the statement A to be true, as drawing a red ball from an urn that contains 100 balls where 95 are red. So the assessor has the same uncertainty, the same degree of belief as drawing this red ball in this sort of random sampling. The same uncertainty. So it's a comparison to express and explain the meaning of this probability. We call this a subjective, judgmental, space probability. It's going back to, I think most of you are familiar with the Kaplan-Garrick paper from 1981 in risk analysis about quantification of risk. It's given there, this kind of interpretation. Also, Dennis Linley has been strongly advocating this type of interpretation. But it's not that common, actually. And a lot of analysts are not aware of this type of interpretation of probability. There are other ways of looking at probabilities also, and for some, this interpretation here is actually more common. It's sort of, there are different versions of this, but one that is commonly referred to is this from De Finetti, going back some 80, 90 years. And it's saying that if the probability is 95%, it's saying that you are indifferent between getting $0.95 or playing a game where you get $1 if the event occurs, the statement is true, and 0 otherwise. So this is different, completely different type of interpretation. And actually it's quite common in economic literature and also among decision analysts, at least some. And there are, as I said, there are different interpretations, different versions of this, going back to De Finetti, Ramsey, Savage, and other from the literature. I cannot recommend this type of interpretation because what we do here is actually to mix uncertainty assessments and value judgment. How much you like money is sort of in the way we did understand the probability. And I think we should really be careful in having uncertainty assessment. They should be on uncertainty and not mixing them with utilities and how you like money or not. That should be separated. And these other interpretations, like De Finetti, have this kind of mixture, which I don't find acceptable in a risk analysis. But there are different views on this, but this is the recommendation I would like to give. Okay, so we go to the imprecise probabilities, and we have the same examples that we discussed previously, and now the probability is not 95%, but it's at least 95%. So we have an interval from 95 to 1. And what is the interpretation of that? Well, it is, we can use the same type of interpretation with this urn. The assessor has the same uncertainty, the same degree of belief for this event to occur or this statement to be true as drawing a red ball from an urn that contains 100 balls where 95 or more are red. But you don't specify exactly. You are imprecise on the number of balls you have. You're not willing to be more precise than that. That's why we call it imprecise probabilities. Okay. In addition, we have to stress that the probabilities of this type here are always conditional on a knowledge, K. We call it often background knowledge. So we should write PA conditional bar K to highlight that. Sometimes we just ignore that. It's tacitly understood. It is there when we talk about these kind of probabilities. Now, these probabilities can always be assigned. I often hear people talking about this situation here is so and so. It's not possible to determine or to compute probabilities. Well, What is that? I mean, you can always assign these probabilities. The problem is that the knowledge supporting them can be more or less strong. They could be weak. So it is the value, or the information value, can say, from that probability is not that large. It's rather arbitrary, but it can always be assigned. So you should always address the strength of that knowledge supporting the probabilities in some way. And when you do that, you have to reflect on issues like this. I mean, is this probability conditional on certain assumptions? Are they well justified? Do you have a lot of data, relevant data? Is there agreement among experts? Do you really understand the phenomena that are really being studied here? Have you looked into the knowledge base really thoroughly? These are some of the aspects that you have to look into when studying the strength of this knowledge. The IPC referring to the evidence, the strength of the evidence, and also the sort of if there is agreement among experts or not. So something similar than I've written here. So we have then, talking about probability like this, we call it knowledge-based, subjective, or judgmental. It's always have to be seen in relation to the knowledge supporting that probability. That is a key message that I like to say here today. You cannot just produce the probability, you have to also include the knowledge and also the strength of that knowledge. Now, when you go from a fixed number, 95%, over to an imprecise interval, imprecision interval, that is giving it sort of reducing the subjectivity in the assignment. It doesn't remove the subjectivity, but it goes from the knowledge, there's a transformation from the knowledge to the P. That is a subjective transformation. When you have a fixed number, 95%, this subjective element is larger than if you have an imprecise probability with an interval. So the imprecise intervals are actually reducing the uncertainty when going from the knowledge to the P. It doesn't mean that the probabilities are not subjective, because you can think about the knowledge as comprising one statement from one particular person. It's really subjective, but we're talking about the transformation process from the knowledge to the P. That subjective element there is reduced by having imprecise probabilities. Okay, so we have then these probabilities, and I haven't so far even mentioned that we have also different types of probabilities. And the most well-known, at least one of them, is the frequentist probability. I call them PF here to distinguish them from the subjective probabilities P. And the PF are something completely different, that they are reflecting variation. And we are familiar with this. We have learned about this in school, but I would like to simply take some few minutes to just summarize what's happening here, because we have to be crystal clear what is the difference between frequentist probabilities and measuring variation, and what is a subjective knowledge-based probability expressing my degree of belief, my uncertainty about something. These are two completely different things. Probability is used for both, but they are completely different. And okay, we have a pin here, and we simply assume that the pin is down when you throw it, is down or is up, simplifying. And then that's the A, pin is down when throwing the pin. And I asking what is the frequentist probability of A, PFA? That's the question. What is it? Well, I don't know, because this is an unknown number or quantity. I just call it P, it's a parameter. It's unknown, and we are into traditional statistical analysis of trying to estimate that P. This is what we do in statistics. It's an unknown quantity. Actually, it's a model concept, because you are saying that the P is understood as the fraction of time the pin is down if you throw this pin over and over again infinitely. So this is, of course, only in the mind you can define that, but that is the P, and you have to estimate that, and you make often sort of a setup with X, the number of successes in n rows. You do some repetition, and you get sort of X number of successes, yes, in n rows, and X is binomially distributed, so you are having a probability model, and the unknown parameter P, and you're starting to estimate that by looking into the number of successes X, and you can estimate that P in the standard way. And you're making confidence interval and so forth, and this is just standard statistics. You can also have a Bayesian analysis where you're using subjective probabilities to express your uncertainty about the P. So then you have the P expressing your uncertainty about the PF. Then you should be clear about what is the difference between these two probabilities. So we have these two categories, and it's essential then to have clear understanding of what is what. The PF has to be justified. They don't exist. In our case, with this climate change example and also this annual meeting example, PF doesn't exist. I mean, you can't produce that kind of repetition that you have to do in order to produce PF. So you have to go, the only alternative would be to use these kind of subjective properties. Therefore, this interpretation that I gave. Okay, that was little about probability, and I would like to say something about risk. And I have not so much time, but I also refer to the webinar that I held in 2015. What is risk? And these are recorded, as Brett was saying. And if you are a member, you have, of course, you are a member of SRA, and you have access to these webinars. Also, I would like to recommend this scribbling on the website. What is risk? Which summarize these ideas within, let's say, 3 minutes. But still, I would like to just also summarize now a few aspects linked to this discussion. What is risk? And I refer to the glossary of SRA, which I think is a very important document. And we have an activity. That could be the life in a country. It could be the operation of a process plant. It could be an investment. That activity leads to some consequences, some events with some effects, some outcomes in relation to something that humans value. And there are often some reference. I mean, it could be the current level, the planned level, or any objectives that are formulated. And there's always something negative, undesirable outcomes. I mean, not all, but there will always be some when talking about risk. So looking into the future, you don't know what these consequences will be. There are uncertainties you are facing risk. And this very general way of looking at risk can be formalized in different ways, as these examples you see here demonstrate. This is a part of the idea of the glossary to allow for different definitions within some certain rationale. And I use this example here to sort of illustrate what I just now said. We have a boulder that could dislodge from this ledge and hit these people, and could be injuries and fatalities. So these people are under exposure and under risk, you can say, because if you think about these events, will the boulder dislodge or not? Will this boulder hit a person? Will it be killed? Looking into the future, we don't know. There are uncertainties. So we face risk. And these two are the key elements in all of these definitions. And so the idea is to have a risk concept that is qualitative and broad like this. And then the next question is, how big is the risk? And then you're into the measurement or description of this concept, and this we do in risk assessment. And of course, that we will, what's the best way of doing that is also depending on the decision situation. But there are some generic, some general ways of thinking that is relevant for all type of risk characterizations like this. And I just summarize these. So we have then the two elements, events with some effects, and we have uncertainty. So in the risk assessment, you have the specified events. Okay, would you like to look into fatalities, for example? Then we look into sort of how do you get these fatalities? And the next is sort of uncertainties. And how should we express the uncertainties? Yeah, that we have already discussed, at least to some level. To express uncertainty, we have probability as a key instrument, a key tool, but also, as I stressed, the knowledge supporting that probability. Unfortunately, we are not done with that. We also have to deal with surprises relative to our knowledge, which is make it even more complicated. This is important in a risk context because the assessment is conditional on this knowledge, and you can get surprises relative to this knowledge. And you remember this, I refer to the black swan metaphor. I guess most of you have heard about the origin of this metaphor. 300 years ago, we in the old world all believe that all swans are white. A Dutch expedition go to Australia and discover that there are black swans. A surprise for us relative to our knowledge. I mean, not for the people from Australia. They were not surprised because there were only black swans there, but it was a surprise relative to our knowledge. And this is the key. The risk assessment with the probabilities are conditional on a certain knowledge. That knowledge can be wrong. So there's a risk aspect into that. And as a decision maker, you need to reflect on that and take that into account. This is an example also demonstrating this. Before 1960, it was accepted knowledge that natural gas cannot explode in the open air. A lot of experiments were supporting this. The problem was that these experiments had too small gas volumes. So you didn't get this explosion. Now we know better. So if you have did a risk assessment about and focused on some event, and you having this this assessment is conditional on this assumption that natural gas cannot explode in open air, and you get a very, very low probability in that case. But the assumption was wrong. Of course, it's hard to know from the analyst's point of view, but as a decision maker, this is extremely important because, I mean, you have to deal with these kind of surprise aspects, risk aspects also. And this is why we have thinking about robust design. This is why we have resilience-based thinking, because we like to have some protection in relation to meet surprises. And of course, it's a challenge to sort of find the right level of resilience, but that's another issue, and I will not talk more about that today, but it's coming more on that when talking about risk management and other webinar. Okay, so you have the risk metrics and producing probabilities or value at risk. This is a quantile in distribution FN curves, like the probability of having accidents with at least 100 fatalities, 10 fatalities, and so forth. Expected loss, risk matrix type of quantities like probabilities of events, probability of B1, probability of B2, with expected loss given B1, given B2 events, and so forth. All these are giving some information about risk, but they have some limitations. All of them need to be supplemented with the knowledge base that support them. And the strength of that knowledge is essential. That is not often being done today, but it should be. It should be always linked to the risk metrics. Also, we have to say that some of these metrics are really poor in representing risk, because think about expected loss. I mean, I often see a number of papers that risk is actually defined by expected loss. And I would say that in most cases could really misguide decision makers if you relate risk to expected loss only. because you don't really reflect on the potential for large extreme outcomes and events, which is extremely important for the risk management, because different sort of distribution will have different risk management policies. Okay, so then we come to the last point on the key topics list, and that linked to the risk analysis field and science. And let me say something about that. I have two questions here. Is risk analysis a scientific field? Is it a science in itself? Yes, I would say. And it's very important. Also, the problem is that risk analysis is not really broadly recognized as a science in itself. That's a problem. I think that is serious, because I really believe that risk analysis cannot really develop and be strong unless we obtain this kind of status that is really broadly recognized as a science, because that has to do with funding for research, the research volume, the number of academic positions at universities and colleges, the number of study programs we have. All that is extremely depending on this, and we're not there yet, but we should be. Let me have some reflections about this, and let's go into this little more in detail, starting with the concept of science. Science, of course, this is a huge topic, and I will not really cover it in depth, but I really like the perspective taken by Professor Sven-Ove Hansson from Sweden on this discussion about what is science. He's saying that science is the practice that provides us with the most epistemically warranted statements, or we also rephrase it as the most justified beliefs that can be made at the time being on subject matters covered by the community of knowledge disciplines. The most epistemically warranted statements, most justified beliefs, produced by the knowledge disciplines. And these are, according to Hansson, nature, natural science, ourselves, psychology and medicine, our societies, social sciences, our own physical constructions, technology, engineering, and our own mental constructions like mathematics. These are the type of knowledge disciplines that he defines. And from that, we can construct a rationale and a structure to sort of understand science and knowledge. Knowledge is justified beliefs or warranted statements. And the most warranted statements, the most justified beliefs, can generate the scientific knowledge of that discipline. And the knowledge is sort of founded on data, information, argumentation, theories, testing, modeling, and so forth. So this is the idea. And the question we can now ask is, what about risk analysis into this? Where do we place risk analysis into these categories? And what is actually risk analysis producing of knowledge? That's the question. Well, then we have to go into what risk analysis actually is delivering. I would say that it has basically two knowledge components. This is also discussed in the core subject of risk analysis document. And it's called applied risk analysis A and kinetic risk analysis B here. And A is supporting risk knowledge generation in relation to other sciences, medicine, natural sciences, and so forth. For example, in relation to climate change. We are supporting the knowledge generation in relation to climate change, supporting the tackling of the issues of climate change. That's applied risk analysis. But we also have a generic risk analysis part B, which is producing concepts and principles, approaches, and methods on how to understand, assess, communicate, and manage risk. For example, when we're talking about what is risk, it's there. And if I talk about what is the precautionary principle saying, and how should we use it in risk analysis, and how should we do uncertainty assessment in relation to risk, in risk assessment? How should we do that? That's also an example of what's in that B part. Yes, and also I could mention the SRA glossary, which was produced as a generic risk analysis activity. Of course, the intention, the motivation for doing that is to apply it, applied risk analysis. Now, so there is interaction between A and B, and a lot of my work on when I was working in industry, then I discovered a lot of issues that I then have to deal with from a more general, generic perspective. So that was generic risk analysis B. Hopefully that will then influence the A again. So this is the way it works, interaction between A and B. Both are us, risk analysis. Both are important, and we are servicing society, the world, by doing work on both. So how would then these relate to these 5 categories that Hansson has defined? Let's look into applied risk analysis first. Well, I think it's obvious that applied risk analysis is supporting nature, ourselves. I mean, all of them, in particular 1, 2, 3, 4. So the first 4 are relevant for risk analysis, and maybe also 5 to some extent, but mainly for 1 to 4. But to come to the generic part, risk analysis B, it's mainly number 5. Also relevant the others, but it's mainly number 5. So maybe we should have a different categories, number 6, because it's not only for risk analysis. If you think about statistics as a science in itself, it's also the same structure. I mean, statistics have a generic part, concepts, principles, etc., to analyze data. A lot of people working on that. I've also done that. Also, you have people, also have the work on supporting other areas, other sciences. You do applied statistics. So it's also similar to the applied risk analysis. So it would be exactly the same. The applied relevant to 1, 2, 3, 4 mainly, and generic part B relevant to 5. So maybe you should have a different category 6 there. So that gives us a way of looking at risk analysis as a science in itself. And the core subject document is then actually saying what kind of statements are we really focusing on in relation to risk analysis. I think that was exactly 40 minutes, Brett. So we have some time for comments and discussion on some of these issues.
We do, and so I will remind people that if they want to ask a question, just go to the question section on your GoToWebinar control panel and type it in, and we will then answer the question. So we don't have any yet, but I suspect that folks are typing. And while they're doing so, I'm going to remind everybody that this video and all the videos of our past and future SRA webinars are available on the SRA website to SRA members. With that, we'll go ahead and, oh, here we go. We have a request from John Lathrop to comment on epistemic versus aleatory.
Yeah, that's a good comment. It is very established, this kind of distinction between epistemic and aleatory or stochastic uncertainty. Now, the aleatory or the stochastic uncertainty is actually not uncertainty, but variation. So when I talk about the frequentist probability or that kind of modeling, it is reflecting the variation in a phenomena or having huge populations and the variation there in the population outcomes. That is actually what this term aleatory or stochastic refer to, that you have variation in populations. That is aleatory. It is, therefore, I think the term is really confusing in the way that it's talking about uncertainty, but it's not uncertainty for me. It's just reflecting variation. Now, the epistemic is the one that I have been, I mean, the probability that I discussed here are expressing the epistemic uncertainty. is related to knowledge. So that is really, or the imprecise probabilities that I also referred to are reflecting the epistemic uncertainties. So the typically, we often see that in sort of, let's say, in nuclear probabilistic risk analysis, you do modeling using probability models. What you do then is to reflect then on sort of, you have variation, and you reflect the variation, yes, and then you have some parameters in that probability model, and the epistemic uncertainty relate to then what are the values, the true values of the parameters. You should also address the epistemic uncertainty related to model error, which is sometimes done, but not always. But I think that sometimes there is a too mechanical procedure in getting the probability model without justification. Think about the example that I had in the beginning here. I mean, the climate change example, and also the example with this annual meeting. It's really hard to establish a probability model. There is no, actually, in this example, easy to define what is actually the aleatory uncertainty, the stochastic uncertainty. Then you need to define a population. Of course, you can do that in certain cases, but you have to do that. You have to specify what population you're talking about, because the model is referring to a particular population. And very often that's not being done, and then it's extremely confusing. And you are uncertain about something, but you don't know what you're uncertain about, because the quantity is not expressed. Okay, a quick answer.
Okay, we do have several more questions. The next one is from Anne Heyerdahl. It says, why do you name it subjective probability, not intersubjective? It is often a shared understanding of probability between people in a group, not a personal understanding or perception of probability.
Yeah, I love that comment. Actually, it's subjective because of historical reasons, but it's really not a good term. Intersubjective very often, but in principle, it's depending on the assessor, the assigner. So then it's sort of referred to as subjective, but very often it's intersubjective. There's agreement about this statement. But also I think that the term subjective is a bit difficult because it's give the impression that it's arbitrary in some way. But therefore I personally prefer to use knowledge-based or judgmental to highlight these probabilities are actually conditional on knowledge. And that gives a little more neutral expression than the term subjective. Thank you.
Excellent. Our next question is from Christer Christensen. It says, could you comment on how to measure or categorize strength of knowledge?
Yeah, that's it's a huge topic, and it has to be qualitatively done, and that is some sort of, many would like to see only quantification in relation to risk, but the problem is that you cannot do that, because when you try to quantify, you have to condition on something, and that part will always be there, and you can't quantify all of that. And then you have this sort of the big challenge of how would you do this kind of strength of knowledge judgments? And I would say this is an area of research. We have done some work, but also go back to some work in the so-called NUSAP system, and trying to have some broad categorizations of what are these factors of knowledge that you look into. I mentioned some of them, these assumptions, the data, the agreement among experts, and so forth. And then trying to make a system from that has been done. So I would just recommend you to look at the papers that is on the last slide of this presentation. You will find some work trying to make systems or structures for how to do this strength of knowledge judgments. So I won't go further into details because it's too technical today. Now.
Great. So the next question is from Sam Chatterjee. It says, thank you for your insights, Terje. What are your thoughts on the role of machine learning for informing uncertainty and risk analysis?
Well, I'm not sure what you are thinking about there. Thank you first for your remark there, and maybe you can follow up a little with what you mean on this. Are you talking about sort of alternative ways of expressing uncertainties, going into fuzzy probabilities and so forth? So maybe a follow up there if this person would like to do that.
Okay, great. I'll keep an eye out for a follow-up question.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
The next one's from Peg Coleman. It says, thank you for your presentation. Regarding the community of knowledge disciplines, particularly for Hanson's category on science relating to ourselves, does SRA need to update its glossary? The microbiome revolution has revealed that Homo sapiens are incomplete without our microbiota. How do we assess, communicate, and manage risk to ourselves as, quote, superorganisms?
Well, that was a demanding question. I'm not sure I'm able to give a good answer to that one, Peg. It's, I think we need to have a direct interaction on that one. I'm not sure. It's knowledge and science are really big issues. I'm trying to make these kind of, I have really focused on certain aspects here today, simplifying that and not covering a lot of issues linked to this. I'm having this kind of focusing on the practical aspects linked to it and making sort of the knowledge literature is really complex and challenging. And we come quickly into aspects like sort of what is knowledge and how to represent knowledge. These are huge topics. And I maybe not answering your question, but I would like to sort of just share with you some of these sort of experience that I have had when talking about knowledge. What is actually knowledge? I mean, a lot of people talking about justified true beliefs, and you come into sort of who is owning the truth in relation to this, and I've tried to sort of stand up against that because it's not possible to build up a framework for risk and knowledge characterizations if that is a starting point. You need to build it on a framework, I think, with justification of sort of beliefs and wanted statements, as I try to do here. I think otherwise you get into trouble quickly. So I'm not sure I really answered your questions, but that I would like to say.
No, I think that was good. So our next question is from Pia Joanna Schweitzer. And the question is, risk analysis deals with anticipations of the future. So there is not only uncertainty about knowledge and probability, but also about concepts of time. How do you suggest we tackle the concept of time?
Yeah,
we're getting big questions today.
Yeah, they're very big questions, and we get into philosophy and other sort of huge topics. But I agree, this is a good point, that we're looking into the future. I mean, risk is about something happening in the future. I think that is completely right. So when I talk about the framework that I was referring to in the beginning here, I had the consequence aspects. And the consequence aspects is related to what happened in the future. So time is a component into that. And but there are a lot of challenges. I didn't actually go into that at all. And if you have a long perspective, it's sort of 100,000 years, and the uncertainties are large, of course. What kind of frameworks are we using for doing assessment there? And the sort of traditional perspectives on doing that is the framework with probability models would not work in that kind of concept, in that kind of situations. So you need to think differently and reduce the sort of foundation on probability models. Probability models is, I feel that a lot of people working with risk analysis still would like to use probability models in domains where they don't actually can be justified or it doesn't make sense. It works in certain cases, yes, very well, but we need to have other frameworks when we are dealing with sort of situations that are more unique and a longer time perspective, as you mentioned, Pia. And then you need to have other sort of instruments than this traditional probability model approach. But you can always use this kind of knowledge-based probabilities that actually the numbers is not so interesting, but it's more about then the knowledge supporting them. So when you have this kind of uncertainty characterizations, you have probability or intervals, you have knowledge, and you have surprise. And when looking into the future in more longer perspective in time, and uncertainties are larger, you will get more and more weight on the knowledge or lack of knowledge and the surprise aspects, and less weight on the probabilities. I think that is a message. You cannot sort of stay, as some people do, nice probability modeling also in these new situations or these sort of emerging situations.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our next question is really a comment, but you might have comments on the comment, and it is also, it's winning the award for the longest of our comments. So this is from Robert Waller. It says, changing from P equals 0.95 to P is greater than or equal to 0.95 for subjective probabilities does not so much reduce uncertainty as hides uncertainty. If we compare many judgments made at P equals 95 level, then after forecast events occur or not, we could identify both what were probability overestimates and what were probability underestimates. If we compare many judgments made at P is greater than or equal to 0.95, then after forecast events occur or not, we could only identify what were probability underestimates, but establish no understanding of probability overestimates. This increases our systematic ignorance, not something we want to do. So that's a long, one.
I think I understand. It's a good comment. Also, and this debate is interesting about, do we actually motivate or sort of like to have these kind of imprecise probabilities, or should we try to stick to sort of fixed firm values, crisp values? That's the question, and there are sort of arguments going in both direction. I think that it's not either or, actually, because I often feel that if you think about it, if you're working in an industry and you have a chief engineer coming to you, you are the decision maker. I would like to hear his view. Okay, here's the statement. I have this probability expressing my view on this. And I don't like this person to say, well, what I have here is an interval from 0.2 to 0.9. Doesn't have much information by that. So I think that on the other hand, if you like to have a more objective representation, you have to sort of stick to that that kind of intervals, but you lose something. Now, the question that come from Bob here was not really about that, but it was talking about some sort of ability to actually check if you are right after the sort of experiment, and talking about underestimation or overestimation. That is somewhat problematic in many cases, because these probabilities I'm talking about here they are sort of expressing uncertainty at a given point in time, given certain knowledge, and supporting decision making. And there's no correct probability number. So overestimation, what does it mean? Underestimation, what does it mean? Because there's no correct. It's your judgment given a certain knowledge. So it's hard to talk about over or underestimation. But if you talk about that you are doing an estimation within a aleatory framework, a stochastic framework, then you have estimates of your probability numbers. And that estimate can be over or lower estimated than the actual true PF value. But that's a different framework. And I'm careful in saying, you have to be careful. Are we talking about a framework we're trying to estimate some underlying PF? Okay, then we can talk about under or below. But if you're doing your assessment to express uncertainty using these kind of epistemic probabilities, these kind of knowledge-based probabilities, there is no under or lower probabilities. They are your judgments. Okay.
Excellent. Our next question is from Dan Hudson, and it says, what are your views about the treatment of the so-called, quote, unknown unknowns, end quote, within the context of risk analysis?
Yeah, that's also a really interesting topic. It's linked to these surprises that I mentioned, and you have these different categories. The black swan metaphor is actually referring to an unknown known, in the sense that we in the old world didn't know, but people from Australia knew it. So it's unknown known. If you have a situation where nobody knows, you have more this unknown unknown. I'm not sure about this example from 1960 with this open gas explosion, the gas in open air. Nobody had the knowledge. So this is some sort of a type of surprise, and it's really hard to do something with that in a sort of quantitative way, because you don't know. But you can do a lot still. You can do, you can address it. Just focusing on it is extremely important. Having frameworks where this is on the agenda. You have focusing on the assumptions. You do risk assessment of the assumptions. You have sort of a red team. You have sort of devil's advocate, sort of trying to really fight and see if these assumptions are correct. You are really sensitive to signals and trying to see what's happening, trying to see when you can get a surprise. So this is an area of I think is of extremely importance, and it has not been addressed that much. It's coming, but it has to be done more. How should we deal with that in risk analysis and in risk assessment? I think it's a research area, interesting research area. Thank you.
Good. Our next question is, well, first off, let me make a comment. We're right at the top of the hour, or just to be about at the top of the hour. We do have about 4 more questions, and we still have over 100 people hanging in there. And so would you like to keep going and try to answer these?
Yeah, that's fine. We go on. We have some questions for you. Yeah.
Great. So our next one is from Johan Lunden, and it says, can you link risk acceptance to degree of knowledge?
Yeah, that's also a very interesting comment. Now, we see a lot that risk acceptance and tolerability is linked to probability numbers. You have a criterion, a target. If the risk assessment produces a probability that is above this level, it's not acceptable, and you should do something. Now, given that you acknowledge that risk is more than the probability number, you acknowledge that risk have to also to cover the knowledge aspects, as I've been discussing today. You should also be willing to reflect on the knowledge and the strength of knowledge when you are discussing, is this risk high or low, and go into discussion about acceptability. Of course, that also includes other aspects linked to values, but I think you have a good point there. You also have to address knowledge aspects in addition to probabilities when using it in relation to some sort of targets. Yes, good point.
So our next question is from Greg Chesterton, and it says, many government policymakers seem incapable of making decisions when risks are described with uncertainty and imprecision. Ironically, they are okay with qualitative red, yellow, green risk assessment, but they balk when faced with uncertainty intervals. They want answers that are easily compared to discrete values. Is your experience different? As a
No,
community, do we need to stop enabling simplistic risk assessment?
yeah, this is a good point. Also, it's there is a conception that the idea that top managers and others don't like to have uncertainties. They would like to have simple answers and all that kind of stuff. I have some mixed experience on this. I think that I often say that, I mean, people on the highest level, I mean, they are really used to this kind of uncertainty risk aspects. They are, I mean, the big people on the top, they are really dealing with uncertainties and risk all the time. And they are, I would often say, I mean, most people on the top are really well equipped and understand this very well. I often say that the problem is partly that we, as the community of risk analysis or uncertainty analysis, have not been able to maybe to do it in an authoritative and strong way. I've been involved in I've seen that happening also when I was working in industry. We presented results to top management, and we didn't do that in a, I would say, in a way that was really convincing. So I would rather say that the challenge is at least in our hands. We have to improve in the way we are actually providing that basis on uncertainty and risk. And I don't think we should say that, okay, we have to do it just so simple, ignoring uncertainties, because they are there. And I think we should just do it better, because we have not done it very convincing up to now.
Great. Greg just typed in that he agrees with your response.
Good, good. I'm happy.
So our next question is, so we have two more, and this one is from Sam Chatterjee, who you'll recall asked earlier about machine learning, and he's typed in a clarification. So it says, do data-driven machine learning methods help quantify risk parameters, or could possibly also inform how we compute risk?
Okay. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm able to give a good answer to this. The question is sort of if you can do this kind of mechanically, and I'm not sure I'm able to give a good answer to this. I need more information from you.
Well, it sounds like you and Sam could have a nice offline discussion.
Yeah, and you should send me some. You should send me an email, and we can discuss it there, and to provide you with some sort of little more informative answer than what I'm able to do now. I'm not sure actually where you were aiming. Actually,
okay.
Learning is a key. Learning is a key thing in risk analysis, and what is learning? In general, this is extremely important. I mean, common frameworks has had the kind of a little sort of constraints in relation to dealing or ability to incorporate learning. If you have a narrow probabilistic framework, you have problems with actually including learning aspects. You have in Bayesian analysis, you have it to some extent possible to incorporate learning, but even there you have a lot of constraints. And the importance of what I'm trying to say here is that by framing the risk characterizations with also allowing for the knowledge to be a part of the risk characterization, it's easier to actually incorporate the learning, because knowledge, I mean, learning is about improved knowledge, you can say. So by having the knowledge explicitly in the risk characterization, make it easier to reflect learning aspects on a broader scale than this just simple updating of probabilities, which is really narrow and it could be really misleading. Okay.
Excellent. So Sam said, happy to share more thoughts by email. So you'll see something coming from them. The next question is from Sissel Ertenstein. It says, thank you for an interesting seminar. I have a question. Do you think risk assessment is appropriate for modern risks such as cybercrime? And what assessment criteria would be most relevant for those types of risk assessments?
Yeah, I will not give in to give you the solution on this. This is too demanding, but it's thank you for your comment. And I think it's risk assessment is applicable for all kind of situations where you're addressing and dealing with risk. A lot of people think about risk assessment as quantification, probabilities, and actually PSA type of analysis. But this, I think, is what we try to do now in at least in the glossary and other documents, is to try to stress that risk assessment is much more, and it must be much broader and richer than just having this focus on quantification. And stimulating this with kind of focusing on knowledge aspects and also surprise aspects. And by doing that, you get a framework where you address the important aspects of threats, the risk sources, and the barriers, and potential sort of surprises and so forth. You put this into a framework where you address risk and also other aspects like vulnerability, resilience, and so forth. That is what you need, not a PSA or QRA type. That kind of framework is much too narrow. And I think that now a lot of work has been done to have this kind of extension in frameworks. I think that is then giving also something for your applications. I think there are some people that are actually seeing security as something completely different than sort of safety aspects. But for me, everything is covered within the umbrella of risk analysis. There is no problem whatsoever with framing or conceptualization of security issues in that framework. Thanks.
Okay. So I let one more question sneak in. So here okay. It is, and it's from Al Ramputh, and it says, "What is your opinion of the precautionary principle?"
Okay, that's a cool one. I've written a lot about that, and I think it's sort of a saying that if you are facing scientific uncertainties, you should sort of do something. You should have some measures implemented to deal with that kind of risk if there's a potential for severe consequences. And to me, that makes sense. If you have scientific uncertainties, you don't know what's going on. Then there is a need for some sort of measures to be sort of dealing with that kind of risk, and also including aspects of surprise. So I think that is what you do or should do, and you always do that case. I think you cannot just be informed by risk analysis. You need to have some other principles also. And this is just saying that. And I would often refer to this as a precautionary principles, saying that you have to do something in case of uncertainties and risks. And you are informed by risk assessment, but these assessments don't say everything. So I say this is a good principle, but it doesn't say exactly what to do, because it's just an overall principle. It doesn't say exactly what to do, because there's always a balance to be made, balancing different concerns. And this principle doesn't say how to do the balance. Okay.
Great.
That was my answer.
That's a good way to end it, I think, on that one. And,
okay.
And I will first thank you again, Terje, for a fantastic webinar. And again, I'll remind everybody, all of these webinars are available on the SRA website. If you're not a member, become a member. There's a lot of really great informational sources on there and a lot of really great member benefits. And that's
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure to have this webinar, and thank you for attending this webinar, all of you. Thank you, Brett, also for this fantastic system that you have providing.
Happy to help. And thank you, everybody. That's it. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.